Okay, good luck.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a great honour to be here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Perhaps what I'm going to say in the next half an hour or so will help to shape that discussion. This image you see is, does anyone recognise it? Has anyone seen it before? It's a drawing by a draftsman called Gandhi, who worked for the great early 19th century British architect Sir John Soane. And Soane's, one of his most important works was the Bank of England. And this drawing is hanging up in John Soane's house, which still exists in Lincoln's Inn Fields. And he got his draftsman to draw his greatest work as a ruin in 1,000 years into the future. And that's obviously not exactly a modest gesture, but he was claiming his position in the hierarchy of great architects. But also he was talking about time, and time is the theme of this talk. It's how can we justify place, given the enormous and increasing power of information technology? How can we justify place in an increasingly virtual world? So what would Soane have said? What justification would he have for architecture? He was, by the way, one of the founders of the British architecture profession. So he has a certain place in the historiography of architecture. So the themes I'm going to try to weave together are contemporary. The challenge of sustainability, the enormous opportunities provided already by information technology, with more to come. So all of those are interesting, but the third is perhaps less talked about because it's invisible. I call it the tyranny of the supply chain. Doing things in the way they're done because that's what we did last time and the time before and the time before, and not thinking about the context in which the ideas and the designs and the buildings and the places we provide, how they should be questioned in an increasingly virtual world, in a very different world that we're entering. Now, one or two personal remarks. When I was in the fourth year at the Architectural Association School in London, we were given an office building to design. That time, what concerned the school and most of the students were the big social programs, education, housing, health, and offices were somehow in a different category, somehow to the off the front page. And they were awful, of course, in the UK at that time. There were shining examples of interesting office buildings in the United States, but the British level of interest by architects in office design was very low. So I was sitting at the beginning of the fourth year with this problem of designing 100,000 square feet of office space on a certain site in central London. And I didn't know where to start. I don't think I'd ever been in an office at that stage in my career, still in my late teens. And I was leafing through the Architectural Review, and I came across this diagram, which was in a little article by the famous historian Rainer Banham. It was a journalistic piece, not a historical piece, about a new phenomenon that had just emerged in Germany, was being promoted by the Schneller brothers, called Bürolandschaft, or office landscaping. And it was an idea. I saw the idea instantly. The building was non-orthogonal. The arrangement of the workplaces was looked organic, not random, but structured in a non-orthogonal way. And what hit me was the idea that the architecture was loose and formed itself around an understanding of the way in which the organization operated. And then there were other features which were incredibly unusual at that time. They invented plants and they invented carpet, neither of which had been seen in any Anglo-Saxon office at that time. And they invented this idea of the Pausenraum, where people could go when they wished. It wasn't a tea lady with a trolley, which was the UK system. You could go and have your break at the time when it was appropriate for you. So there's a different order, a different style of culture, office culture, which I had never seen before, and I found enormously attractive. And it made me interested in the idea of the office being designed from the inside out, not necessarily provided by developers, but by, as this particular firm in Nordhorn in northern Germany was a textile company, and the architect had worked from scratch with the help of the organization team Schneller in order to invent a form of building which was totally novel, even in Germany at that time. And from an Anglo-Saxon point of view, it was quite extraordinary, quite interesting. And I became interested in the relationship between organizational structure and building form and interior design. So, putting this into its context, in the context of decades, the dominant mode of the office in the Anglo-Saxon world, and in other parts too, was fundamentally Taylorist, following the 19th century invention of scientific management by Frederick Taylor, in which workers were treated as units of production. And if you studied them at all, it was in terms of getting the maximum efficiency out of the muscles and the eyesight of the individual operator. What was new, and this was happening at the same time as Bürolandschaft, but more important than Bürolandschaft, was the consequence of the Second World War. It was the rise of the Social Democratic Office in Northern Europe, particularly in Germany, which was a reaction against Taylorism. Hitler, by the way, was one of Taylor's greatest fans. He rather liked the idea of people being treated as units of production. And then the new thing, which was sort of implicit in that diagram I've just showed you, was the idea of the office being somehow more fluid and overflowing the boundary of the building itself, what I call the networked office. So, at its best, the Taylorist office was magnificent. This was Frank Lloyd Wright's Larkin building in Buffalo in the early first decade of the 20th century. And you see its order. It's the white-bloused women and the black-coated men on the steel desks, steel case. And in the spandrel panels, can you just see it? There were the things you had to believe in: intelligence, enthusiasm, and control. And the exterior of this remarkable building pulled down long ago, but a moment in the history of the office which was paralleled by a literature of the design of equipment and furniture and etc. in the most efficient way. And at its greatest, in the 50s, there are, of course, magnificent buildings constructed, particularly in the United States, following that tradition, Seagram building. But the iconography of both the interior and the exterior is the grid. You take your place within a preordained structure which someone wiser than you has invented. And when I was a student a bit later, as a graduate student in the States, and studying the office, it occurred to me that offices were, in the North American system, were Yankee ingenuity, I must say, were designed so that the layers of longevity of the building, the shell, which architects designed, lasting for, let's say, 50 years, The services, designed by another tribe, the mechanical and electrical engineers, on a 15-year cycle at that time. The scenery, the interior fit-out, space planning, as the Americans called it, which had a 5-year duration, and then the sets, which were being rearranged day by day by facilities managers. They weren't even called that at that time. But what was wonderful about the American system, what struck me as a European as being so fascinating about it, is that these layers were completely independent of each other. In fact, they hated each other. I remember going to talk to famous architect Philip Johnson once, and I made the mistake of saying to him that I was doing some consulting for a space planning firm, JFN Associates. And he said, space planners, they're all hacks. He was quite clear that you didn't need to respect them. They did their job in their box, and he did his job in his box of architecture, and never the twain or the whatever it is shall meet. But that was an idea I tried to articulate, and was picked up more eloquently later. The idea of the layering of office architecture, that the names of the layers, the stuff of the short term, the space planning, the services, the skin, the structure, and then the site. Each of these layers being legitimate, each of them being equally important. In fact, if you talk about importance, if you added up, there's a wonderful book by Stuart Brand called How Buildings Learn, in which he picked up this point, that if you added up over the lifetime of a building all the amount of money that's spent on the short-term stuff and the fit-outs, etc., it would make architecture, financially speaking at least, a branch of interior design, cumulatively. And what was so good about the North American tradition of space planning at that time, that it was very professional, very skillful, and well ahead of anything in Europe. So that's the arithmetic. You add up the capital costs and come to a sum demonstrating that the stuff that actually hits the user is not just operationally, but financially the most important aspect of design. Another twist in the story, this exemplified by this wonderful building by Niels Torp for SAS in Stockholm, was the rise in Northern Europe, not the UK, not France, but Germany and Scandinavia particularly, of the Workers' Council. You won't find this surprising, but from an Anglo-Saxon point of view, it is surprising that the Workers' Council had the right to be involved in discussions about any change in operating policy or organizational structure. And guess what? What consultation led to? This idea that the individual room for the perfect worker, with its own window which you could open, a door you can shut, a light you can adjust, in the same space as all the other people in the building, and an architecture that wraps itself around the street, which holds the thing together, and maybe you don't think Swedes have a sense of humour, but they do, because you see the parasol on top of the boardroom on the left of this diagram. They were mocking the hierarchy at the same time as demolishing it, because by introducing equality. And then the other thing that comes out in this diagram is the importance of the common social spaces, the street, the development of the atrium idea, but it is a place where interaction happens, where there's planting, and which celebrates the organization as a whole. So a very, very interesting office culture. So that's the history of the last 80 years or so of office design. And the question I'm going to ask now is what's going to happen next. Because not so very long ago, 15 years ago, the computer escaped from the computer room. It became possible to communicate, as you know very well, anywhere at any time. So we're living in a world of super connectivity. And the part of that world that is that's managed by organizations is the bottom half of the diagram, the left and the bottom half, which is what you might say the internal office. And the light grey to the right is everywhere else that work is being done. And guess which part of this diagram is expanding, and guess which part is diminishing. The work has escaped from the workplace. This invisible cloud of connectivity means that I think over the next 2 or 3 decades we're going to rethink all the norms of the way in which we use space, but more importantly, all the norms of the way in which we use time. Time is now malleable. We can design time in a different way. Now, if this sounds shocking and frightening, it may be a little bit consoling to think that it had actually happened before. In fact, before the office was invented, on the left diagram is what is now called the Corporation of Lloyds, conducting its business in a coffee house, the Starbucks of its day. That's where they met on a random basis, or semi-random basis, in order to meet influential people and to do deals. Not inside the building, but in interstitial spaces in the city. And the other example, and you may think this has terrible elitist connotations, but it was such a clever invention. The Gentlemen's Club of the early 19th century, that's the reform. And the way it worked, you paid a subscription, but the way it worked was serendipity. It increased your chances of meeting intellectually and socially and business, although you weren't allowed to have any papers, you still aren't to this day, but you would conduct business activities in a palace, which you paid for by your quarterly subscription as a member of the club, if you were allowed in. A very clever, ingenious Victorian idea of using space over time, and very thrifty at the same time. So Bill Mitchell, who I used to work with when I taught a bit at MIT, put it all very neatly, that the 2 iron laws that shaped the offices of the early part of the 20th century were the necessity to be in the same place at the same time as your fellow workers, symmetry and co-location. Neither law is dominant today. We have the task collectively in organizations like ours and in yours of understanding and inventing new temporal and spatial conventions that are appropriate for the 21st century. And it's happened before. It happened in the early 19th century in the United Kingdom when the factory system started in the valleys, and the people who had been working on the fields, up in the hills, with a calendar based upon the saints' days and the seasons, which they had got used to over hundreds of years, had to come down into the valley, into the mill, where they had to learn to work by the synchrony of the machines that they were tending, in a timetable which was imposed upon them, not by nature, but by man. Richard Sennett, the sociologist, someone I admire enormously, has a critique of modern architecture. It's quite stringent. We're in love with bigness. We're in love with overdetermined forms. We have eroded public spaces. We can't say no, we architects. We are too much in love with what we do. We're always pleased to be asked and have our tummy tickled. And we always do what we're told. Even though we squawk, we do what we're told. And we, above all, we do not challenge in this amazing moment of structural change the office supply chain, which comes from the money with investors, goes to the planners, the architects, and eventually the corporate real estate and the FMs and the IT and the users. But it's unidirectional. It's unstoppable. It's monofunctional at each stage. And it has, believe it or not, minimal feedback. And this is absolutely true. it is extremely difficult on any project or in classes of project to have feedback from the end users to the supply side. It's certainly in the Anglo-Saxon world, it's led by money. So 3 generic types of procurement: the tailorist office, the developer, leased buildings, standardized designs, exchange. Not so strong in the social democratic world, let's say in Germany, where offices are still purpose-built, highly specific, and long-term ownership is taken for granted. That is not the dominant form. And then there is the emerging reality of the networked office, which is escaped from the can, as it were, and it's where you pay for services, will pay by the hour, which responds to customer demand and will be measured, I hope, by the value the fluid use of accommodation will add. So it ought to be end users first, demand-led criteria. Services could be, as in hotels, paid for by the hour. Corporate operators would have to face users, would have to be responsible to them. Property owners would have to behave like hoteliers in the office world. And they'd have to respond to demand. I hope this is going to happen. And just a fundamental rule in this situation is that buildings don't do anything on their own. They're inert. It's just stuff. It's how they're used that matters. It's the catalytic value that comes from an intelligent use of scarce resources. So efficiency, effectiveness, adding value, and expression are the criteria, and of the 3, what the buildings and the interiors and the spaces in between the buildings say, that's the most important thing. And these things can be evaluated within the balanced scorecard structure: finance, business, process, customer, human capital. And you can measure efficiency and effectiveness and expression, and you can invent performance measures through time. And time I'm going to come to again, because we know this, but we are not acting on it. If you measure space use in offices over time in the working day, the bit that people are at their workplaces, the yellow, the green, and the red, is usually, and we've done this hundreds of times, about a quarter of the time. The blue bit, which is about 20%, is people being in the office but not at their workplaces. And the grey is the people not being there at all. I happen to live, when I'm in London at the moment, in the Barbican. I look out at these office buildings immediately adjacent in the city. And in the middle of the night, lights blazing, the huge amounts of energy being expended on nothing. Meetings. These data you can trust. Most meetings are tiny and short-term. It is, out of the total number of meetings, it's relatively rare to have big meetings. So inventing buildings that are good at bringing people together, that are effective at stimulating creativity, and of course the classic example of Google, perhaps a little bit stereotyped now, but trying to attract a certain class, age group of office workers to their particular business, and doing it wherever they happen to be. So I think there's a massive opportunity for design here in this situation to be more inventive than Google. It's to use the process, the design, construction, and occupancy process to reinforce and, if necessary, redirect and revitalize organizational culture. I think it's a tremendously important role for design. So designing the process is critical. Leadership, systemic thinking, data, feedback, and user communication and involvement are all necessary. It's much more important to say this in the Anglo-Saxon world than it is in Holland or Germany, but these things are very, very important. And of course, you don't even have to be there anymore. So, back to my theme. If we were intelligent beings and had just arrived on this planet, and we were totally virtual, and we had all the benefits of virtuality, what arguments would we have to pull together in order to justify buildings like this, places like this, cities? And of course there are important things about buildings and the space between buildings. They're repositories of memory. They are very good at serendipity, at chance. They're very good at sociability. They're very good at expressing meanings. It's culture. So that's why, in this increasingly virtual world, paradoxically, the central parts of London, West End and the City, and Manhattan are increasingly important, despite this amazing technology. And it's not a new idea. This is Nolle's map of Rome in the 17th century. And what I like about this is that the cloisters, the markets, the Piazza Navona, the streets where all the life took place are almost half the area of that early Renaissance city. They knew how to use fluidity. I remember having some students not so very long ago and getting them to say which bit of London they prefer to live and work in. Canary Wharf, the North American model, or Soho, and guess which they chose. And in order to demonstrate their choice, one of them brought a restaurant map of Soho, 1,000 front doors, a wonderful image of urban design. And what they hated about Canary Wharf was security. And back to Soho. Bank of England, an enormously secure building, a fortress guarded by soldiers until quite recently, where all the gold sat in the basement. But inside, the spaces were social, one court after another. So you can reinterpret Sennett's critique. And a final warning, unless we're prepared to rethink not just the office design, but the office supply chain, we won't be able to take full advantage of information technology, and we will break on 21st century creativity and development. So listen to Sohn and think about in terms of centuries and not just decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a very interesting talk again, Frank. I believe we have time for a couple of questions.
Hello, my name is Frank Bruninghouse. I would like to ask you, thank you very much. My name is Arndt Bruninghouse. I work for Royal Haskoning as a, among other things, a space guy. My question is this. Just recently, Melissa Myers, who is now CEO at Yahoo, decided that the, let's say, the liberality with which they had introduced a flexible working concept in America was to be reversed radically. She basically called everybody back into the office and said, we need, to stick around each other and to, be with each other in order to be productive and to be creative. And she basically called everybody who had flexible work plans back to the office under the threat of being fired, in fact. Could you elaborate?
Was she North American by any chance?
Yes.
Well, it's a reaction against. Well, I think in some ways I can be a little bit kind to her. A reaction against silliness and gestural ideas, rather than the reality. And I think you have to manage the freedom, if you see what I mean, and not just allow people to make all their own decisions. They have, of course, they have a right to have an important say in it. But an intelligent manager in this moment in history would use both internal and external spaces and not plump all her money on one. And it's a reaction against that easy success of giving nerds free food and thinking that they do good work. And in fact, they only stay for a year anyway before they move on to somewhere else where they get even freer food. So I'm quite cynical about it. I think it's short-sighted and not very intelligent.
Thank you. Okay, if there aren't any more questions, I would like to thank you, Frank.
Unless there are nerds in the audience, anyone want to speak for the nerds? No,
all right, thank you, Frank.
Yeah.